evening, everyone. Good evening. Well, thank you. Woo! If I could ask everybody to come in, take their seat, and if we can close that back door, we'd like to get promptly started. A lot of new faces here. My name is Gloria Neese. I'm the Executive Director of the Celebration Foundation. Welcome to Conversations, our New Urbanism Committee's Conversation Series. I do have a couple of commercials. One, the Celebration Foundation, in this same church with wonderful acoustics, in another few weeks, we're going to be starting our concert series, and it's a wonderful concert series. We start on December 8th with the Brass Band of Central Florida, and I promise you it's a wonderful concert, and it gets you really in the holiday mood. Our big concert this year is on January 6th, and that is Branford Marsalis. For jazz fans in the audience, Branford is a pretty big name. We have tickets available. You can go to our website. There's some information on the table when you leave today. Also, the first weekend in December, because this is the Celebration Foundation event, we also have the Holiday Home Tour in Winter Wonderland. And we have this year 10 homes. In fact, thank you, Debbie McDonald is going to be on the tour. Debbie Jackson, our chair, is here in the audience. It is a beautiful and a wonderful event. And we also have a couple of surprises for you, and I'm not going to share what that is. You have to come on the tour. And then we have a Winter Wonderland where we have 16 decorated trees and 16 decorated tables. So it really is a fabulous event. So I just wanted to get those commercials done. But the community, the New Urbanism Committee, and a lot of them are in the audience. I would like to ask them to stand. If you would just briefly stand and be recognized. Thank you. This committee started because of the new urbanism. This community was built on new urbanism, and when I started with them, I didn't even know what new urbanism meant. But there's a lot of reasons why this community works the way that it does. And we have, besides having Charles Adams speak tonight, I would like Joe Barnes to stand up and be recognized. Joe Barnes was our first speaker for New Urbanism when we first did the Community Conversations series. And also Tom Sonnenberg, would you stand up and be recognized quickly? Tom Sonnenberg. Last year we were fortunate that we had Michael Eisner and Peter Rummel, who gave our community conversation talk last year, and they were fantastic. And Tom Sonnenberg was our moderator and spent a lot of time and energy and shared his talent with us. So tonight we're going to be enjoying Charles Adams. He's going to continue the conversation. If we have time, we would like to take your questions, and I have some volunteers, New Urbanism volunteers, that would be happy to share a note card with you and write down your question as you're inspired, and then as we come to the conclusion of the evening, they'll be able to just raise the note cards and they'll collect them. So now I would like to introduce to you, please give them a warm welcome, Terry Wick, who will be moderating the conversation with Charles Adams tonight, and Charles Adam. Terry and Charles, welcome.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know me, as Gloria said, I'm Terry Wick. I live here in Celebration, and I was fortunate enough, after spending time as a teacher and an elementary principal, to go to work for the Walt Disney Company at Walt Disney World. And after I had been there for about 7 years, the Celebration Project was incubating. And at the time, they were looking for an individual who could be the liaison between the school district, and the Celebration Company or Disney. And so Charles hired me. He was my boss. I'm going to let him tell you about all the exciting things he has done, but he's currently working on another development. He has worked on a number of developments since leaving Celebration. He and Don Kaloran for a number of years, and they still work together. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Charles.
All right, thank you.
So let's start with, how did you come to work at Disney?
I was actually trying to buy some of Disney's property. I was working for a company called Trammell Crow, and there was a site up near Lake Buena Vista, and I managed to get an audience with a guy named Todd Mansfield, who, by the end of the first lunch, to my pleasant surprise, said, could I give him a copy of my resume? So I never ended up buying that land for Trammell Crow. I ended up taking the offer, and it's one that I'll always remember because my wife, who's on the front row here, Lauren, we were in the hospital having our first child, and in came this delivery of a big plush Minnie Mouse, all this Disney, probably good things to eat, T-shirts, all kinds of things like that. And she said, that would be a fun place to work, don't you think? And she said, you need to just go ahead and call them. So I called Todd Mansfield and told him I'd take the job. And that daughter today is 27, going to be 28 in March. So it was a while ago, but one I'll never forget, and glad that I did.
Can you share some stories about some of the contributors to the celebration?
Absolutely. In fact, I told Terry and Gloria that I really like this format because one of the things, if Disney's anything, it's a storyteller. And we saw the power of that here and how it played out and all that we did. And in fact, I remember when we first started, and Charlie will remember this, when we first started the Celebration Foundation, we wanted to make sure that people who moved into the community got to understand the history of the place. And so in kind of Disney fashion, we had some Disney writers come over and start to prepare a collection of stories. And it was called a traditions class. We just made it a celebration traditions class. And it was this whole set of stories about this land and about this place. And it's the same kind of training that new cast members go through when you go to work for Walt Disney Company. We just applied it here. And I know that really helped people start to have a common bond in that initial wave, because people were coming from all over the world, buying to move into this place. So have the opportunity to come back many years later and tell a few of those early stories so they don't get forgotten. I'm very excited about that. And so what I'm going to do, I'm not doing a PowerPoint for you. I'm just going to show you some faces as I clip along and tell some of these. And if you are listening to me, Terry, and you think I'm leaving out something important, just ask a question about it. When you think about what inspired our team early on, it definitely started with a vision that Walt Disney had when he originally assembled all of this land. And one of the fun things that we got to do was, kind of dip into the archives and take a look at what had been put on paper, what had been drawn. And one of the things I'd always remembered seeing this big futuristic city with the high rises and a bubble over it all. Once we got our hands on the actual renderings themselves, and you kind of peeled away the glass bubble, what you saw was a very traditional kind of place. The architecture of the homes and how the streets laid out. And yes, there were these kind of, circles that went out from it, but it was very much, I think, reminiscent of the kind of places that Walt had grown up in Kansas. And so that gave us the freedom then to really look to the precedents, not only in and around this region, but the whole southeastern United States, we felt like. And it didn't have to be some modern contemporary view of a community. It really was tied back to the roots of what Walt had intended to do with the property. I was a lot younger at this point. I'm on the far left. My wife, when she saw this, as I was clicking through them today, she started laughing because I look so much younger. But I think a lot of us did up there, including Tom Sonneborg, who's tucked in there. He's got the shades on, so he's kind of the second row there. But we've got Todd Mansfield and many of the early team. And we had this opportunity. I called it Disney's never met a piece of research it didn't like. So we got the opportunity to do a lot of research. And one of those, as we were getting close to engaging the planners to start drawing again, we kept getting all these references to these great towns that, through focus groups and things that we had done, that we needed to look to for planning examples. And so we got to use the Disney plane for a week. We left on a Monday morning, and we flew up and down the eastern seaboard. We went to new places like Seaside, which at that point had been underway for about, 13 to 15 years. In fact, I remember we all were so impressed with Seaside, and we started talking about, how we could apply a lot of what we saw there, which were some of those early new urbanist principles. And I remember saying, well, gentlemen, here's the deal, though. We've got to sell in the first year what Seaside has sold in the first 15 years combined. So we got to be careful that it doesn't come across as too resort-like, too vacation home-like. We've got to have something that has a lot more horsepower to move the kind of absorption of homes that it would take to establish a real town here in Central Florida. But the funny part of this story, and by the way, the tour guide, I'll tell you about him next, but we had the benefit of a guy named Charles Fraser, who, if any of you have ever heard of Sea Pines and Hilton Head, he was kind of I'd say he's kind of the grandfather of modern resort community development. Places like Amelia Island Plantation, near where Lauren and I live today, Kiowa, certainly Hilton Head. Those were all, Charles Fraser organization kind of developments. Charles tagged along on about half the stops in Savannah and Charleston, places he knew like the back of his hand. And it was a wonderful week in terms of learning things. But I remember as we were getting off the plane at the end of the week, I was thanking the Disney pilot who had taken care of us all week, and said something about the plane. He goes, "Oh, well, y'all are the last group that are going to ever fly on this. We recently, kind of doing our annual checkup, and some things we were concerned about." So, and at first I thought he was joking, but the next thing I knew, it was on the Disney MGM studio lot. And for all I know, it's still, there, just, kind of on the back lot, and you can see it on the tour. But we had a lot of fun getting to go and look at ideas that were in other places. In fact, as we were walking today, somebody was asking me on the architectural tour about something, and she was saying how that was such a clever idea. And I said, well, to be honest with you, we didn't originate that idea. We just stole it from another place. I mean, I can't do it as well as I used to, but for the first few phases that we did here, every one of those parks, a lot of those relationships, I could tell you where the precedent was that was created from. Some of them are obvious because we named them Savannah Square, but there are others that were borrowed ideas from all over the southeastern part of the United States. So we just kind of were pulling it together in a new and modern way, and still to this day, I'm proud that we stole good ideas, and I will continue to do that with all our other developments. Charles, I could sit here and tell you stories all night about him. One of the most fascinating men that I've ever known, and we had the benefit that many of you got to listen to Peter Rummel last year. When Peter came out of business school, out of Wharton, Charles Fraser hired him for the Sea Pines Company. And that's where Peter learned the community development, resort development business. And he, like anybody that spent any time with Charles, just greatly respected him. And fortunately for me, Peter brought Charles Fraser in and made him a key strategic thinker, and he shared ideas with us the entire time that we were starting this up. And I know as long as Peter was still here, we would get his ideas. Whether we wanted them or not, we got his ideas. But one of the things that he did, the company, prior to a couple of us arriving, had already done some master plans for this land. And they were incredible works of art, but they kept getting rejected by the folks in California, in Burbank at the headquarters. And the fundamental thing was they were kind of drawings for drawing's sake, but didn't have an underlying business plan. And Charles had this way of writing, and I don't know if clearly with this group you'll know, but there was a newsletter produced by Kiplinger, and it's this Kiplinger newsletter, and it'd have, what's going on business-wise, what's going on tax-wise in D.C. and all that. That was the kind of style that Charles Fraser had in these memos that he would send to Peter, urging him to do things certain ways, and I became the recipient of a lot of those later on. But this quote that you see up here from the Bible was contained in one of those memos that Charles sent Peter after he had been there and seen some of the plans. He did about a 25-page memo of, this is what you've got to do to build the next great American town. And it was amazing. I kind of flipped it open a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this. The things that he was already seeing as trends or things that, didn't really get traction until 5 and 10 years ago. But he was predicting them back then because of this voracious appetite he had for knowledge. And I think the thing that inspired a lot of the team members is he spent a whole section talking about the kind of team that needed to be assembled. And he was quoting Varro from 60 A.D. and quoting, verses from the Bible. And, if you read that, you kind of felt like somebody set the bar pretty high if you were fortunate enough to get hired. And he continued to be a mentor for all that we did here. In fact, one time when, again, we like to study things a lot at Disney, and I'm sure the company is no different today, but we had a good plan. We had, a real solid foundation, but again, we were having another brainstorming session, and towards, 2/3 of the day was over, and Charles just stood up, and he was clearly frustrated with this. And he said, I'm looking at this room, and there were people there that I know some of you know, like Tom Lewis and Peter Rummel and Todd Mansfield, and he said, you've just got to stop. You remind me of this painter, who was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And he had the paint dripping in his eyes, and he couldn't see what he was creating. But people standing down on the floor of the cathedral could see, what this was. I'm telling you guys, that's where you are. You need to just get on with it. In fact, if Nike had the commercial at that time, he would have just said, just do it. And it really was that kind of kick in the behind that we needed to just quit studying and actually start to implement. And that's the kind of thing that Charles did. And the other invaluable thing about Charles was, unlike 99% of the developers I've met over the years, he would tell you all the mistakes he made in his development career. And, most developers, want to tell you about all the success they had. And that was the most valuable thing that Charles did, was share all those lessons learned, because he had done a lot of development, seen a lot of development. He had been through 2 or 3 cycles, and again, probably helped us stay out of a lot of trouble as a result. So Charles Fraser absolutely was a heavy influence on all this. The other one was kind of a surprise to us, and this is Jim Rouse. Many of you probably have been to Rouse developments like Baltimore Inner Harbor, South Street Seaport, and New York City. His company was one of the earliest developers of malls all over the country, and then got into these anchorless retail centers in metropolitan areas. But one of the things he was known for was he developed a new community called Columbia, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. And as we were going through and getting advisors involved with how you build a community for, at that time, 20 years ago, community associations were, a part of doing a large-scale planned community. And without a doubt, the Community Association at Columbia, Maryland was one of the most successful, and may still be one of the most successful community associations in the country. So they said, some of our advisors says, you need to go there. So I just cold called Jim Rouse and asked if we could come and meet him. And he graciously accepted that request, and he said, but I'm an early riser, so if y'all come up here, we need to meet at 6:30 in the morning at my office. And we did. We were not going to miss an opportunity to sit down with Jim Rouse. And a couple things I remember from that. When we sat down, he had sitting in the middle of this conference table y'all remember construction paper, that you used in grade school. There was this just 8.5 by 11 red construction paper document that the construction paper was on the top, and on the bottom had those brass brads holding it together. And I happened to be sitting pretty close to it, so I reached over and started flipping through it. And it was his original business plan for Columbia, Maryland. And what I saw was he had right at the beginning, he had his 10 goals for the community. And most surprising was financial returns was like number 8 on it. And during the discussion we had, I asked him about that. I said, if this was your business plan and you were handing this to a bank, how did you get away with putting the financial returns down so low? He said, I just told them if I got those first 7 right, number 8 would take care of itself. And that was very true. The most surprising part of the visit, though, was he said, I am so glad that y'all are getting around to doing what Walt Disney originally intended to do with that property. And then he proceeded to tell us how Walt, 20-something years before, had come to Columbia, Maryland to sit down with him and ask him about if you were going to be building a community, what are some lessons that he's learned that he could share as Walt embarked on this Florida project. Nobody in the room had a clue. And we had folks that had been working for Disney for a while. And again, that was that, kind of jolt of inspiration that we were, heading down the right path with this. We were fortunate over the next several years. Several might be an exaggeration because Mr. Rouse died a few years later, but he would come down, not as often as Charles Fraser, but I had him come down 2 or 3 times, and we'd let him sit in on some meetings, and then a few days later, I get this, 3 or 4 page letter, again, a little similar to Charles, but it'd start off with, well, I liked hearing all the progress, thought I would give you some of my thoughts, some of which you may love, others you may not like. And again, we would get the cold, hard truth about what he was seeing, that maybe we were heading in the wrong direction with it all. And I noticed when a book that kind of told his story after he died came out, this story about Walt coming to see him is in it. And so just an amazing story, and we were fortunate that he continued to invest time with us as we came through. Jack Robertson. I mean, I think most of you know, if you've taken the architecture tour, that Jack and this guy, Bob Stern, in fact, most of the guys in the photo with Bob there were the lead master planners for this community. And I just thought I'd just tell you some of the kind of inside stories about how they worked together and just kind of the personalities that they had. There was about a 6-month period that I would leave my wife and our newborn and leave on either a Sunday night or a Monday morning, and I would fly up to New York City, where we kind of had a workroom inside Cooper Robertson's office that we had commandeered for the planning of what became the town of Celebration. At the time, it had this real catchy name called the Osceola Multi-Use Development, and I'm really glad we didn't use that. But if you were to go in some of my old files, you'll find the prefix on all those as OMD, whatever. It was because Celebration, came later. But the way it typically worked each day of that week is the associates there at Cooper Robertson and Stern's office would be in that room working on this neighborhood or that park. And then towards the tail end of the day, Jack would show up and Bob would show up. And I would say usually Jack was there first because it was in his office. But Jack's style would, they'd have kind of the big plan laid out on a big drafting table. Well, whoever was drawing would get out of the seat and Jack would sit down in it. And he would roll up his sleeves and then he would look at, what had been done that day since he had looked at it the day before. And he would say, well, are we having any issues? Are we struggling with any, particular areas of the day? And inevitably, we had been having some kind of debate about something. And so we'd bring it up, and he would pick up the pencil and start drawing. How about this? Or how about that? And it was incredible to watch him work. And in fact, the scale is still to this day. I don't know how great planners do it in getting the right scale when you're looking at 500 acres or 1,000 acres at a time, and they're drawing these wonderful little streets and parks like you're living in now. And then Bob would come in, and he always came in with a guy named Paul Whalen, who's also on this image up here. Paul's on the far right. And Bob's style was similar in that he wanted to know what might be the hang-up that day or what they're working on, but he had an encyclopedic mind. And so when you would say, well, here's what we're struggling with, this and this, and then he would say, well, that's like such and such, on Long Island out at Northampton, or that's like such and such in Rome at this location. And Paul Whalen was vigorously taking down notes. And so the next day, Paul would show up with images of those places. And you'd be amazed at how it was like the perfect solution for that challenge that they were doing. So Bob Stern's mind was incredible for remembering places that he either studied or he visited. Kind of back on Jack, I remember Tom may remember this too, we were working in our offices, we were still up in our offices near SeaWorld, so it was before we, got down to the Aldo Rossi building up here. And Jack, we were having one of those good heated discussions about something, and we kind of landed on the right solution, and I don't even know if I should say this in the church, but Jack said, this is so much fun. This is better than afternoon sex. And and when I think back about it, the energy that a great, planner at that time had, that he was pouring on this plan in this place, it was contagious. And, that's how much he enjoyed it. And, it shows up. I've selected some quotes for these guys as we've been moving along. In fact, I forgot to say the one, Jim Rouse is the one that stuck with me. I use it all the time, saying that a community is a garden for people to grow in. I love that one. And then I love this one from Jack, talking about what light, does in a building. Bob Stern, he was very talented, a great leader of a firm. Both of them had heavy hands in all of this. But Bob always proved to be an interesting challenge for us because he was also on the board of the Walt Disney Company at the time, we were doing this. And so if he didn't like, where we landed on something, and meaning it wasn't his idea, he would just go, I'll talk to Michael about this next time I see him. It's just like, it was not fair that he would, be with Michael Eisner the next day at a board meeting and could, tell Michael his side of the story with it all. But fortunately, he was very talented, and as were a lot of his associates. And so you see the product of it, here. In fact, I was reminded today on the architectural tour, how we got to assemble this who's who of architects, from Bob Venturi and Graham Gunn and Charles Moore and all these, wonderful architects. And the two that were kind of guiding all that, I mean, you could say that was close to herding cats when you have that amount of world-class egos. I mean, architects. And and that they were the two that kept it a very collegial atmosphere through it all. In fact, one of my favorite things was when Philip Johnson, got engaged in it. When he came into that same kind of workroom that we had, and he kept calling Bob Stern Bobby. And I love that because, when Bob Stern's in the room, he kind of commands the room, and he's always dressed really well and very formal. And to have Philip Johnson calling him Bobby, it was just kind of like, it helped tamp down a little bit of that kind of environment that Bob created with them. But there was a stage where we were substantially along in the design and the master plan. Everything was settling down. And I remember having a conversation with Todd Mansfield because I was the one that had to put in the capital authorization for all these design fees. And I got to sign, every time the bills came in. And I said to Todd Mansfield, I said, any one of these could really finish out the plan at this point. We are spending quite a bit of money on this very talented team. And he said, don't worry about it. Let's just, keep going. Well, fast forward to several months later, we were in front of Michael Eisner, Michael's right arm, a guy named Frank Wells, and a couple of other folks that, kind of followed them around as they would come to Florida to look at progress on things. And Jack Robertson was up on one side of the room at the head of the room. Bob was on the other side. We had not a PowerPoint. We had 35 millimeter slides, but we had like 6 of those carousels set up. And Bob and Jack, the first slide comes up and it says the new American town. And they proceeded over the course of the next hour or more, taking Frank and Michael through those slides, talking about the history of American towns. And it was very powerful. 2 of the best salesmen you will ever come across. And Todd Mansfield leans over to me and he says, that's why we continue to pay their fees. Because at the end of that meeting, we got the approval to move forward with the project. And it was on the strength of not only their designs, but the passion that they had and no doubt the expertise that they possessed and why we would do the things that we would do in that community. So, again, we could go on all night with Bob and Jack stories. Philip Johnson, just a short little story about him, but it was, once we got the master plan settled, well, the next thing was the village. You know, it's just one block that way. And I don't remember how the idea came up. Tom may remember. But there was this decision that we needed to have this collection of world-class architects come have a hand in their fingerprints on this village. There was a town, I want to say in Columbus, Ohio, or somewhere where actually a manufacturing company had for years for community and civic buildings provided the money to bring in great architects, you know, to that community. And so it was a little bit of that idea, but we were going to do it all at once, not you know, over 20 years. And so that team got assembled. You know, Philip Johnson, Michael Graves, as I was talking about before, Caesar Pelly, and we gave them an assignment. Each one of them, we gave them a building and said, this is what we would like for you to do the design for. We provided them with the program, meaning the square footage, how many of this type of room and that type of room. And they were to go and not only draw what that building was to look like, but they had to produce a quarter scale model of it. And a quarter scale is pretty meaningful in terms of its size. It's not a tiny little thing. It is a building, you know, even a house could be this scale with a quarter scale, you know, kind of thing. And so we had this evening where every one of those architects was to come, and again, it was in this war room at Cooper Robertson's office, and they would not only present the drawings, but the last step in their individual presentation was to take that scale model and then place it on the model. And we had this model raised up above the ground so that it was eye level. So, you know, you could get a real feeling of how that street was going to feel long before these buildings were built. And a couple of funny things. Joe may have told this story when he did a presentation. But it was such a big model. In fact, some of you who were early purchasers here might have seen it in the temporary preview center that we had up on the northern pastures up there. We put that model in there for everybody to see. But where the lake was in the model, we cut a hole out of it because the model was so big. If you wanted to get views from the lakeside looking up, you know, Main Street, you had to be, you know, kind of up in that like that. And the funniest thing was seeing Bob Stern's head just pop up, you know, in that lake. And every one of them, when they would drop their piece in, would go in and do that. But after everybody had done their presentation, I was talking with Mr. Johnson, and I was half apologizing for, you know, what we had paid them. Because I probably shouldn't tell even to today, but it was a very small amount of money. They did it for, I think, the opportunity to collaborate. And I was sitting there saying, we really fretted over what we should. He said, listen, just stop worrying yourself. If you had paid us any more, it would have been offensive. He said, this way I can just look at it as an honorarium. It was, I still look back, it was amazing. It was partly because of a guy named Wing Chow. Some of y'all may have heard of Wing Chow over the years, but he was, you know, like the master inside of Disney to go and find architectural talent that then he would discuss with Michael Eisner, and they would make the selections. Very rarely did we, as project managers, get to select an architect. It, you know, came from above from Michael and Wing. But Philip was a lot of fun, and in fact, one of the things that was interesting, we had a woman on our team at the time named Christy Overgard, and her last name is escaping me at the moment now. She ended up getting married and heading to Chicago and leaving us here. But a few years later, after she'd left, she ended up becoming the executive director for Philip Johnson's Glass House, which is in Connecticut. It was one of the famous pieces of architecture in the country. Charles Moore, one of my favorite kind of members of the architectural team here. The first time I met him was not because we were doing the preview center. It was because we were doing a design competition. The company's name when I first started working for Disney was called Disney Development Company, and DDC. And then later we got merged into Walt Disney Imagineering. But one of my first assignments was managing a design competition. And we didn't talk about my background, but it wasn't architecture and planning. I was a business degree, person. And so I got thrust in to this design competition with three very different firms that were competing. One was Charles Moore, and it was actually a collaboration among Moore, Rubel, Udell, which was one of the practices he had started out on the west coast of the United States in California, and then Anderson Moore, who, if any of y'all attend services here, Arthur was the one that was the architect for this building. And this competition was for the Disney Institute. And it was at a time when we thought the Disney Institute and this new town were going to be one and the same. That it was going to be a town and gown kind of relationship. And we thought it was all going to be here. Y'all know the Disney Institute ended up being more up in the Disney Village area, but at the time we thought it was going to be here. And so as part of the design competition, we had those architectural firms come down, and the best way to show them the property was to put them in a helicopter. And we would get up in the air and buzz all around this 10,000 acres. And it was Arthur Anderson, Charles Moore, myself. We all had our headsets on, and I was kind of giving the tours. We're flying around. And I looked over, and Charles was asleep. And I thought, well, that's got to be jet lag, kind of thing. And a little while later, before it ended, he was awake. And so I didn't think much of it. Those helicopter humming, I thought, wow, that's what put him to sleep. Well, then we go to the conference room, and now we're starting to lay out all the things about the land and all the research that they needed to consider. And Charles, just went like this again. And now it's starting to get, sensitive about that. I was putting him to sleep. And on that particular time, though, Arthur leaned over and said, Charles has narcolepsy. And this is just part of working with Charles, kind of a thing. And it was just one of those, you never know what you're going to see and what you're going to experience. But I did have the occasion to go out to Charles's studio in Austin, Texas, where at the time he was the dean of the College of Architecture there. And his home was his studio. And that home gave more insight into who he was. I mean, if you go look up Charles Moore, you'll find the architecture that he did, but you'll also find that he was an illustrator, and he illustrated children's books and all kinds of things. I mean, it was like he was drawing his dreams. And when you got in his house, it was like you were not in the house of an adult. It was like you were in the house of a child who had run amok with all kinds of creative things hanging out. And there, I noticed they had this, nice kind of sleeping couch. So and when we're in the middle of the meeting, he felt it coming on, he'd just slip out and go lay down there. But he just had this really soft-spoken way about him. And by the way, they were the ones that won the competition because Michael Eisner was so impressed with the drawings, the renderings that they did, because you kind of could instantly feel yourself in it. And of course, none of that ever ended up occurring. But we did bring Charles and Arthur back to be a part of the team for downtown, and he did the preview center. And in fact, just a little point about this, maybe Jeff or Floyd, y'all can add this to your tour, but the notion of the tower was the result of something that one of the places we studied down in Coral Gables, when George Merrick was developing Coral Gables back in the 20s, he built a tower so that during the sales process, he could walk you up the steps of that tower and point to where your lot was going to be or where that house was going to be built. And so that was the inspiration for the tower there. Of course, ADA and all kinds of other things got in the way of us being able to use it that way, but symbolically, that's what it was a reference to with all of that. David Weekley. I'm sure some of you are living in David Weekley homes, and again, just a bundle of energy kind of guy. And he had just won, I think, Home Builder of the Year award for the nation. And I decided to cold call him. They didn't have any operations in Florida. And I ended up flying to Houston, Texas, and had the opportunity to tell him what we were up to. And back at that time, as I was going around pitching different groups, we had just this little 3-minute video. Now I look back at it, and it was so basic and elementary. I don't know how we got anybody to buy in. But I remember David, when we got to the end of it, I said, "So would this interest you, coming to Florida and being one of our builders?" And he's like, "No. There's no way y'all are going to do all of that." And I'm like, no, we're serious about this. We're going to do this. And he's like, "There's no way." And I said, "Well, you get such a quick no. I mean, why did you even have me come out here?" And he says, "Well, you get a call from somebody from Disney, you got to take the call. You got to take the meeting," kind of a thing. And I said, "Well, if I could come back and give you an update from time to time to show you we are serious about this, would you take another meeting?" He goes, "Sure, I'll do that. And well, as we did that a couple more times, the next thing I knew, he showed up here and said, "Well, I'm coming to Orlando. I'm going to be a builder in the community. I'm going to go ahead and set up my building operation." I said, "Whoa, that's not how this works. You can apply to be a builder, but we're going to have to consider you among several builders." He goes, "I'm going to be a builder," and he says, "I'm going to get here, and I'm going to go ahead and get my sub base figured out. I'm going to go," and he said, "I'm not going to build homes that look like the things that you're going to build in Celebration. I'll be doing them in some other neighborhoods, but I just need to get to know this market." Well, in hindsight, he beat the pants off of our other builders. And in fact, it was a case study in how to launch a new business in a new market. But again, something today, there was a stop on the tour, and we're talking about the Charleston singles, Charleston side row houses, which to this day is one of my favorite kind of designs for a home. And I remember we had those. We wanted David to do them. He's like, "No way, I'm not doing those. Those are never going to sell. They're never going to sell." Like, "No, we've tested this. We've done the research and qualitative surveys that they will sell." And he's like, And if you're going to twist my arm and make me do it, I'll do them. And I mean, what'd they sell out? In a day? And so he came back, he said, can we do some more Charleston side rows? I think we could do a lot more of those. And in fact, that was a, kind of foreshadowing of another meeting that came up. So we were in the midst of building out phase one. We were well into it. And David and his right arm, a guy named John Johnson, both of which I've stayed in touch with to this day, they wanted to take us to dinner. And they took us to dinner at, was it called the Grand Hyatt Resort that was up near Disneyville? I mean, it was one of the nicest hotels at that time. And we got there, and it was David Pace, who I think some of you probably know, and it was Don Caloran and myself, and then John and David Weekly. And the first thing was sitting at our table, it was a private dining room, was this lead crystal home that they had commissioned, that it was sitting on a glass base, and etched into it said, David Weekly Homes and Celebration Partners and something like that. And you could see that through this lead crystal house. And it was a celebration house. Joe Barnes would have been proud. They had followed the pattern book, with it. And so we were just very impressed by that. But then David got around to what the meeting was really about, the dinner was really about. And that was, he said, okay, so I know at times you had to pull me for things during phase one, but we are here. We're there for phase two. In fact, Don, Charles, we want to buy all of phase two. We want to be the only builder. And we're not going to take no for an answer. Well, he ultimately had to take no for an answer, but, for a guy who was very skeptical that this place was going to happen, it was very rewarding that he was so convinced of the future of this place that he was going to take down all the single-family lots in the North Village at the time. And of course, he's still building here. I went and visited some of their models not too long ago. So David Weekly, by the way, from here, Don and I went and did a project up in Fort Mill, South Carolina, kind of a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. And David followed us there. And is still a builder, up in that neck of the woods to the day. So great relationship. Howard Gardner, some of you may be educators. I know this one next to me is. And he was at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's the guy that really came up with the multiple intelligences approach to education, how we're all different, and we all learn differently, and we all apply our intelligence differently. It's always about finding what that is in a child so that they can achieve their best. And I will tell you, I should have mentioned it up front, we had the opportunity to go engage with some of the best, not only in architecture and planning, but in education and healthcare and technology. And Howard is an example of that. And we could get the doors open to have these conversations. And we got to Howard's office. We kind of laid out for him what we were wanting to do with Osceola County Public Schools. And so the time came for the ask, would you help us? And unlike David, he said yes immediately. And I said, well, let me just, provide a little caveat here is we're probably going to take some heat for Disney getting involved in public education. And so, you have an excellent reputation, and, we just want you to go in with your eyes wide open. He said, no hesitation on my part. And I said, well, why is that? He said, I have been waiting for Disney, to get more involved in education. He said, they're great supporters of education, but it's a difference when you get engaged. He said, I don't think there's another company on the face of the earth that has an opportunity to expand the teachable moment in a child more than Disney does. And it was, I believe it to this day. And of course, Terry went on from here, out to California to help Disney get more involved in education. But that's how we were able to, bring in these thought leaders and all these various cornerstones. Kind of down to just a couple more of these. This is one of my favorite stories, and I wouldn't be surprised if you heard it from Tom Lewis or Tom Sonneborn before. But we had done our best to get not only Robert Trent Jones Sr. and Bobby Jones, but we also tried to get Reese Jones to collaborate on the Celebration Golf Course. It ended up, and I'll save it for another time, the whole story, but we ended up with Robert and Bobby, for this. And if any of you are, golfers and you follow the history of this family, to say, things were tense among the family members is an understatement. In fact, that's why we thought it would be such a coup if we could get all three of them, to collaborate on a course. And Reese wasn't having it, but we ended up with these two. And we were in one of our design review meetings. So, the way architectural plans work is you have different stages of the design documents. And so we were probably at round number 2 with Bobby and Trent. And we were in our conference room for them about to lay it out. And Bobby said, "Guys, can I just stop for a moment and take a time out?" And we were like, "Well, sure." And he said, "So listen, y'all know my relationship with my father has not been the best. And I can't tell you how much now I appreciate that y'all pulled us back together for me to get to work with my father. And this has brought it all back to me. Our relationship is going to be different from here on out. And to make that point, I want to share something." He reached in his satchel and he pulled out that book, Golf by Design. And he said, "This is the first copy off the press. And I just want to open it up and read the tribute." And it was about honoring his father. And we were all in tears. we were worthless the rest of the meeting, but it was just one of the most heartwarming kind of meetings, sessions that we had ever been in. And they went on to design a great course, one that allowed for all levels of play. Tom had his fingerprints all over that, leading them through it. But it was just one of the sweetest moments we had through all of this. I was supposed to let you ask some questions. I haven't done that.
So do you have any favorite sales stories?
Isn't that neat how it happens that way? So some of you may have met Tony Rizzo along the way. We had just kicked off what was called the Development of Regional Impact process in the early 90s. And when you do that, it's public information at that. And y'all know, probably from experience, Disney's not high on telling secrets, before their time. But we were at that point that there was no turning back and we had to do the public process. And so, front page of the Orlando Sentinel hits about Disney starting the development process for this new town. And so it hit the AP wire, and the next thing I know, my assistant, Sonia DeLong at the time, Sonia Hernandez now, she said, "Charles, there's this guy that keeps calling, and he just will not take no for an answer. I'm telling him, it's way too premature to be talking about, new homes and that kind of thing." She said, "Could you handle this one?" And I said, sure. And I got on the phone with him. He introduced himself, said he was in the Air Force, and he was based out in Colorado, and that his family loved Disney, and he wanted to be one of the first buyers in the community. And I said, well, that's wonderful to hear. I will take your name. I'll make sure Sonia, doesn't lose that. And when we get to that time, we'll reach out to you. And he said, well, we come down to Disney quite often. Any chance that, next time we're down there with the family, we could come by and meet? I just want to, kind of meet you face to face and everything. And I was like, no harm in doing that. Yeah, sure. Next time you're down, let Sonia know. And, well, that was on like a Monday. On Thursday, Sonia had on my calendar a meeting with the Rizzo family. And I walk into the conference room, and they're all there. And I said, well, you didn't tell me you were coming to Disney this soon. He says, well, we just really flew down here just for this meeting. So the pressure was on. Long story short, he wanted to not only be one of the first buyers, he wanted to be the first buyer. And at the end of the meeting, I said, well, listen, Dr. Rizzo, we are at least a couple of years away from, having the launch of the sales. This process is going to take almost that amount of time. And he said, but I want to give you a deposit today. And I said, well, I can't accept a deposit. And that's where that line came from. He says, are you kidding me? This is America. You're telling me you won't take a check from me for $50,000 today so I can hold my place? I said, as much as it pains me, I cannot take that check from you. And he was persistent up until the day we had the lottery. And my biggest fear was that the Rizzo family was not going to get their name drawn. If I could have rigged it, I would have done it. But whoever it was, Price Waterhouse, that was pulling them, wouldn't let us tamper with anything. But he had already, like David Weekley, in advance, he'd left his commission at the Air Force, took a job with Florida Hospital, and he was here whether he was getting into Celebration Phase 1 or not. It was amazing. And so we had a lot of, that kind of enthusiasm, but none at the level that Tony Rizzo.
Did he get in?
He did get in, by the way. And I know some of you know him, but he ended up working with Florida Hospital, and actually ended up in a Victorian home right across from Lauren and I, where we lived over on Savannah Square.
So what was your most embarrassing moment?
I've had a few of those over the years, but this one's an easy one with it. And so I had to get a little photo of the family in there, but this was a few years ago, clearly. This was when we were living here in the community. On the right is my mother, and she's holding our son, Charlie, who at the time was, maybe 2? And then daughter Mimi is in the middle, and then next to her is my grandmother on my mother's side, and then on the far left is our oldest daughter, Morgan. And you see the photo of the Lakeside Park there. So, big deal, hot summertime here in Celebration. It was the grand opening for the Lakeside Pool. And we, like a bunch of other Celebration residents, had all our gear, headed out there, and got in the pool, started playing around, and Charlie completely blew out his diaper. We had to close the pool. And it's like 2 days it was closed to drain the pool and do whatever they needed to do. And I mean, Lauren was convinced that everybody was whispering that the Adams family was responsible for this. So that was a lot of, that was definitely the most embarrassing moment. Of course, these kids are grown up now, scattered all over, and we've got, we waited a little while to have our fourth daughter. She came after we left here, and she's still at home with us. She's a sophomore in high school up in Bernardino Beach High School, Florida.
So do you have any embarrassing stories about Celebration team members?
Well, you know, I don't know so much about embarrassing, but knowing that he was going to be here, I couldn't miss the opportunity to tell one of my favorite Joe Barnes stories. So I told you earlier that I didn't have an architecture background, and I knew I needed to have somebody that knew something a little about it. And we had this concept. Well, let me say, this is how it started. We had done research, and I'll do this quick little story on the research effort. We hired a woman named Diana Pomar, actually a part of the original Sea Pines Charles Fraser organization. And we had sent out 1,000 surveys to people all over, trying to find out, you know, what they would look for in a new town. And then after we did that, we said, well, now that we got the quantitative information, we need to do the qualitative. And so we developed a questionnaire that was going to be then done in a telephone survey. And I can't remember how many Diana thought we needed to be statistically significant, but it was going to be at least 100 phone calls or more. And of course, that never met a piece of research we didn't like thing came into it, and we just kept adding questions. In fact, we were the first developer to ever use psychographic profiling in it. And so you had to ask a series of questions to be able to break it down in what was called as vals to psychographic profiling. And Diana got the questionnaire, and she said, there's no way we're going to be able to ask all these questions. You're lucky if you can get somebody to stay on the phone for, 6 to 8 minutes. She said, we did a test just in our office, and this is going to take 20 minutes. So we can't do this, Charles. And I said, well, can you just humor me on this? Can you do a test called 10 people? And if it turns out we're not getting the information, we'll figure out what to go take out. But right now, I want all those questions on that survey. Well, she called back 2 days later and said, so here's the deal. All 10 stayed on for 30 minutes and more. We had to get them off the phone. And so we'll go ahead and do these. And so one of the parts about it, though, was we had everyone who participated in it, we asked them to send to us photographs of their favorite town that they've ever lived in or visited. And the same thing for home styles. Tell us, what your dream home is, kind of a thing. And again, it blew the researchers away that we had so many of them do that. And so the next assignment was, okay, here's all these great places and these great residential precedents. We need to go and understand more about those places. And so I was looking for a summer intern to do this. And again, I think back to how crazy it was. At that time, WDI was getting 75,000 resumes a year. And WDI might hire 6 people or something. And so the point to that is we got to look at the best of the best. And I found this resume of this guy named Joseph Barnes. And the thing that impressed me was not only had his architecture degree from UVA, pretty notable institution, but he already had gotten his master's degree from Princeton in architecture. And he had, while he was at Princeton, he worked with Michael Graves, and he was at Cohn Patterson Fox for a while, which, is that where you met BJ? That's right. And Cohn Patterson Fox was one of the groups that was in the design competition that Charles Moore had been in for the Disney Institute. But the best part was he decided to go back to business school. So he was at Darden, UVA's business school, and he was in between his first and second year. And I thought, not only is he a well-educated architect, but he's going after a business degree, so we could speak the same language, which I was having trouble with some of the other architects. And so we brought him down for an interview. I laid out for him that what his summer assignment was going to be was I needed for him to travel to those towns that people had indicated that they loved. So I said, Savannah, Charleston, Coral Gables, Thomasville, Georgia. I mean, we had this list, and I said, so here's what I'd like for you to do Key West, other places, and I said, so when you go, I want you to take photos of the homes. I want you to take photos of the street. I want you to go down to the courthouse and pull the plats, because we want to know how deep the lots are of those places, and I want to know how wide the alleyways are. I mean, because if these are beloved places and they're still working today, they must have done something right. Let's see, if we can figure it out by you collecting all this. And so Joe, after I describe it, he's looking at me, he's like, so you're telling me I'm going to get to travel all over the Southeast, take photographs of beautiful towns, and you're going to pay me for this? And I said, yes, we will do that. He said, because this is what my girlfriend and I do for our vacations. And so fast forward, Joe comes aboard for the summer internship, and at the end of the first week, he walks in, he says, that's a really funny joke you did. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, and those of you who either work for Disney or have friends, every paycheck came on Thursday. We got paid weekly. That's what Epcot really means. Every paycheck comes on Thursday. And he hands me his check, which a few months ago he found and sent me the photo of. And it may be a little hard to see from your distance, but it says $0.00. I only wish I was that clever. It was just a fluke of the system. But he thought it was just going to be vacation. He said, I am a struggling student. You should see all the student loans. I need to get paid. I said, we'll get you paid. But long story short, after he graduated, we offered him the job full-time to come and be the town architect.
So what do you consider some of the secrets to the success of Celebration?
We need to do a time check. I think I've blown way past my time. How long was this supposed to go?
How long is this supposed
to? Well, let me say it this way. I am so impressed that so many of you came out this evening, but you will not hurt my feelings at all if you need to get up and go. But if you'll hang around for a few more minutes, I'll try to do this pretty quickly, because some of these things are what we still do with not only Don Calor and I did with our company for 17 to 18 years, but it's what I'm doing now with another large company, public company, who's decided that they need to do some community development on their 2.8 million acres of land. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about alliances and values. And I don't mean home values. I mean what are core values. And so I'm going to take you through a couple things. As usual, I didn't have to look too far, for support for what we were about to do. Walt Disney said it in this quote that, he wanted to work with American industry to create this new town. And that Disney halo afforded our team the ability to go and talk to anybody in the Fortune 100, 500, particularly when we started talking to them about how some of their products might get used in a real town. And so we went about breaking down what some of you may have heard and talked about. I know it was in our early preview center videos. We talked about cornerstones of health and education and technology, and when we say community, it's kind of the sense of community. And oh yeah, by the way, to be a successful town, you had to have it designed beautifully as well too. And the secret to the success was the group of partners and alliances that we got to assemble to help us launch this place. And just to give you a glimpse, so kind of behind the scenes, we had 12 builders, 12 of the best builders that you could find, not only in Central Florida, but in the U.S. All these companies like Honeywell and GE and Marvin Windows, and under health, we had the same, in fact, the one that turned out better than we could have ever expected was the relationship with Florida Hospital. They so exceeded our expectations of what could be done. I'm still amazed at it. And to be back there last year in that facility for that Eisner Rummel event just was again proving how they had taken a good idea and made it into a fantastic idea. Technology, some of these names have changed over the years as things have consolidated, but we were getting to walk into the labs of Bell Labs and AT&T Labs and Northern Telecom and Apple, and we were seeing what they thought was coming 3 years later, 5 years later, and that's how they all got engaged. Education, we've already talked about a little bit. We were able to assemble not only folks like Howard Gardner, but a bunch of his peers who were the most respected kind of educator of educators, that were in the country, not to mention a lot of the universities here in Florida. On the sense of community, see there, Charlie, we got SunTrust right there, was one of our key alliances. And Charlie, we had a 3-member board of the foundation when we started it up. It was Todd Mansfield, myself, and Charlie. And SunTrust was supportive not only with his time, but also with their money. And that's how this got pulled off. It wasn't any individual planner, it wasn't any individual team member, it was time and money and resources from all these great companies. The thing that I wanted to say, though, is early on, and I think this is an adapted one that I did for our company that Don and I set up called Celebration Associates, but it's very similar to what we ended up using to select our alliances here. Right off the bat, we were able to pick up the phone and call, this corporate America leadership and get them engaged in the planning for this place. But as we got into it, maybe 18 months to 24 months, we noticed some of the relationships were just going extremely well, and we noticed others were not. And that's being diplomatic. And, inevitably, what was causing them not to go well had a lot to do with the risk and the unknowns in doing a large-scale community. And so they would think that, we hoodwinked them or something, and we knew all along it wasn't going to work that way, and so we changed the rules, and so they didn't feel like they needed to live up, to what they had committed. It also had a lot to do with revolving doors. These big companies, everybody's getting promoted or sometimes getting fired, but And it was, hard to identify a champion, much less have one with continuity. Well, I said, we need to take a time out, and we had a woman named, again, Christy Overgard. I said, go back, look at our alliances, and let's kind of analyze why some are working and the others are not. And when we cut through it all, what we found was the ones that had the most alignment in core values of their company with what the core values were that we had identified for building a town from scratch through Disney were the ones that when the surprise came, they're like, oh, well, that's a problem. Let's see how we can work this out. And, would get the problem back out of the ditch and up on the road, and we're heading down. And so it fundamentally shifted then how we recruited the remainder of the alliances that were brought to bear on the project. We would, before we would ever meet with them, we would search everything we could find in their annual reports, online. By the way, online was absolutely in infancy at that point. I don't know, some of the first residents moved in, we not only gave you your street address, but we gave you an email address because maybe 10 out of the first 350 people that moved here had an AOL.com email address. I mean, it just didn't exist at that time in any meaningful way. But then we would meet with that company, and we would, I left out a key part. We would fill out this assessment. We would have our own scoring for as many of those categories as we could before we met with them. Then after we met with them a couple times, we would go back and rescore it. Because the main thing was, were they walking the talk? I mean, every company had core values, particularly the level of companies we were talking to, but that didn't necessarily mean they lived it and breathed it. And then we would reveal, to that company what we were doing with it. And again, that's how we ended up with so many great partners. It was such a valuable lesson. And by the way, I'll tell you that some of this came from Stetson University, who had a professor, Larry Rosen, who had used this approach to sharing of values in some of his research and his work with literally tribal nations in the U.S. And when you can identify that you've got these shared core values, it's amazing how much more you can accomplish with it. And we still use this to this day, and was one of the most valuable things we did. And the fact that we don't have all the answers, like Walt said, and we need a lot of help in doing these very complicated, kinds of places. Let me see. I can't remember if I had anything else. Oh, no.
So what are you most proud of from your days at Celebration?
Again, that one's a softball in that it's the people that we got to meet. It's been a lot of fun seeing familiar faces of those who bought here, but the alumni base that came out of this experience, for people that worked with us here. Some of those folks joined us in Don and my company as well, and we've got to continue those relationships with colleagues that we had. But then it's also been true for architects and planners. As I told you, we never got to pick our architects and planners to a great extent. There's probably a few exceptions in there. But when you have your own company, you get to look back at that same group and say, okay, so they were a great architect, but were they fun to work with? Maybe not. And so we are still working with folks that the relationship started here and is still going today. Rob Robinson with Urban Design Associates, whose firm was the, primary editor of the Celebration Pattern Book. The community we're launching right now up on north of Jacksonville, they are, again, the primary editor of the pattern book that we're doing. We've evolved pattern books over time and how my projects have used them, but it all comes back, to the people with it. And, we take so much pride in seeing how, as we've all kind of dispersed, to see what members of this team have done in their own projects or projects that they led for other companies, and people have to be at the top of the list. The next two things, and I'm not saying this just because Gloria's here and y'all are hosting this, but the Celebration Foundation, when I was back last year and y'all played the video, I think, can't remember if it was before or after Eisner spoke, but to see the programs that this organization is now doing, again, like Florida Hospital, is so far and above what we had hoped it could do. The community involvement, the programs we were doing with students, taking them to colleges, the meals, the thriving in place. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about being involved in community development, is see people take charge of the community they live in. Disney's clearly not running this place like everybody predicted, back then, that this was going to be a Stepford Wives kind of place. It was a real town that Dave residents moved in. And seeing what the foundation has done is amazing to me. And I will tell you, again, a little inside baseball here, but we almost didn't get to set up the Celebration Foundation. And I'll tell you who pushed it the most, that helped me the most, was Charles Fraser. And again, another idea we stole. There was a development up near Beaufort, South Carolina called Spring Island. And they had set up this real estate transfer fee approach for environmental protection kind of thing. So we took it and twisted a little bit, but we had some of those heated debates over how people were going to react to having a real estate transfer fee tacked on to when they sold their home. And a couple members of our team were absolutely convinced we were going to make this town sale-proof if we had that in there. And so the best we were able to get across the line was it was a set fee amount that got to increase by CPI over the time. And I can't remember if it was $350 or something like that. But, we knew it wasn't as generous as we should have made it. In fact, I will tell you, every development I've done since, it's been a percentage of the home sale price, anywhere from 1.5% to 3%. And it, absolutely put those foundations. I'm sorry, Gloria. I wish I could have won that debate, back then. But boy, it puts them on much more solid funding. The last thing that I was really proud of, and it's probably the thing that put my heart in the most, was, Disney getting involved in the public school. We put our values, right there in the middle of town by having a school that's in the neighborhood, not out on the outskirts of town. There were a lot of contributions that we made, but all those companies that joined us made generous contributions. And it was hard fought to get a public school district to let Disney be involved. And I mean, most of you are close to it know that we didn't decide what go on day to day in that classroom with that teacher, but everybody was fearful of the mouse and what we were going to do. And despite the fact we were given all that money and getting all that leadership and education from the U.S., I mean, there was a time when I thought it was not going to get approved, by the county. And it wasn't unanimous when it did get approved. And it's the thing we probably took the most heat for when we first started the community as well, too. But I still look back and say, that's one of the things I'm most proud of. And now when I come back and I hear about how good the school is, and I got to meet a young woman today who went to school there, and saying how much she appreciated what we did, that definitely, makes it easy, kind of what I'm proud of. And I could tell you all kinds of other things, but those are the biggies. So, I've overstayed my welcome.
Never overstaying your welcome, but
Oh, thanks, Clark. So you should have, my heart went pitter-patter when you said that 1%. But sometimes the things that you have to fight the hardest for, are the things that are the most worth it. So anyway, let's give Charles and Terry a big round of applause.
Thank you.
wow, for you.
And I will make just a quick comment, but when you said the alumni group, when we had Michael Eisner and Peter Rummel out last year, we had about 30 of the Disney, the DDC alums come out, and you're still all friends, which is really kind of so amazing. And you all do share a bond, about creating this community. And I think everybody here will say there is something special about living in Celebration. And we can't really identify it. We don't know why it exists, but there's something about Celebration. So I don't know if anybody has a question. We can take maybe one or two questions from the audience. If you have a card and you want to ask a quick question, I'd be happy to come get your card. Thank you. That's a long question. Can you explain why the governing documents are so complex? Uh-oh. And what is the one thing you would change in retrospect?
Oh, just one? Believe it or not, at the time this was all set up, I would tell you that was kind of state of the art. Looking back now, and I'll tell you the other thing, even though there's 650 community development districts in the state of Florida today, there weren't back then. This is one of the earliest ones. And nobody, I think, had been as extensive with what a community development district, could do or would do, much less did, back then. And so, we had the best talent in the country drafting those documents. This is an area that Charles Fraser probably studied more than anything, because it was always the most challenging part of a new community. In fact, it was Charles that urged us to do the foundation. He said, because in his experience, and not only in his own developments, but developments he had been involved in across the country, with the passage of time, human nature in associations was that a lot of those, what we called community software programs, would inevitably get whittled down, and that the only thing that was left, maybe from the original vision, was, mowing the grass and replacing the signs that get knocked down and all of that. So we spent a lot of time on this topic of governance and trying to get it right. And in hindsight, I do think, given what I've heard from residents and from some of our own colleagues that live here, the challenges that have come, and I definitely think it would be done differently today. But frankly, because of a lot of things that were learned here. The new community I'm working on, we again are having an independent district. It's a souped up version of a CDD. It's called a stewardship district. And there's only about 6 of them in the state of Florida. And why there's so few is because you have to have both houses of the legislature approve a bill, and it has to be signed into law by the governor. But we are doing it differently there. We are kind of linking together the association and the district in a way that eliminates some of the conflict and creates a more collaborative structure with it. But I tell you, because it's a little new the way we're doing it, 20 years from now, the residents may be saying, why did you do it that way? Kind of thing. So I've always felt like, and I know most of the team did, that, once residents were here and they controlled those organizations, that if they found a better way to do it, we thought we equipped them, with the tools inside those documents to allow them to change things to make it their town and their way. Easier said than done, I realize that, but, that's generally what was set up. But I definitely wouldn't tell you that, we would do it exactly the same way, because it's proven to have its challenges.
Charles, that was Debbie, and she wants to thank you for your thank you for all that you contributed. We raised 4 children here, and they both still loved every day and all 20 years. So,
Well, love that. Thank you.
One more question, anybody? All right. Again, a nice round warm of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if I could have my new urbanism committee to please stay with us. We'd like to get a picture. And if you have some questions for any of the guys, just step forward. Thank you, everybody.